Okay, I was going for the longest title. This is Making the Emigrant's Journey Short. Samuel W. Richards' 50-day journey. And I left out the words from Liverpool to the Salt Lake Valley in 1854 and changes in the trail after the first 8 years. So, just a little context. We know how immigration started. In 1847, 97 days for the Vanguard Company. The rest of the people who traveled in 1847 didn't go much faster. Not surprising, it was the first time any of them had been over the trail. But the next year, we've got companies who've been over the trail twice now, and they're no faster either. In fact, for the first 8 years of the trail, the average days to reach the Salt Lake Valley was 99 days. To put in context, you're traveling for over 3 months. And that means if you're gonna go to the Salt Lake Valley, you need enough money to have enough provisions to pay for 3 months. Now, I had a relative who hired on as a teamster, so they paid him to go. But if you're taking a family, that's not gonna work for everybody in the family, obviously. I got thinking though, it's not just crossing the plains. A lot of people were coming from overseas and they're coming up the river from New Orleans. So riverboats started traveling from New Orleans up to St. Louis in 1811. They started traveling on Missouri in 1832. Their average speed was 5 to 7 miles an hour. So they're going about 120 miles a day. In 1847 to 1854, the average time on a steamboat from New Orleans to St. Louis was 8 days. And from St. Louis to Canesville or winter quarters, about 13 days. So you've got another 3 weeks on the steamboat, and you're now up to 4 months traveling. There are other issues though with steamboat travel. It's not safe. 576 boats were lost on western rivers between 1810 and 1840 or 1850, and most of the travelers are coming after 1850. It's no safer then. The number one cause of loss of steamboats were snags, explosions, 233 explosions in 1848 alone, between 1,000 and 2,500 deaths, and you know it's a problem when you can't even count all the people that have died. You've got a pretty wide range there. There's also collisions. The street racers of the time were the steamboat captains. They're out there drag racing on the river and ice. The average lifespan of a steamboat on the Mississippi River was 4 to 5 years, and it was shorter on Missouri because it was a much more unpredictable river. There was additional risk, principally from cholera. You pick up cholera in New Orleans or on the steamboat on your way to St. Louis. And I ran across a quote from 1854 on the Mississippi north of Cairo, Illinois, sort of 5 days in a row. March 8th, 1854, we had hardly been on our way for an hour when once more a sunken steamer that hardly held together was seen lying ahead of us. The next day, we had not gone very far before 3 sunken steamers were seen lying ahead of us. 2 of them had been shattered by tree trunks, snags, and the boiler of the 3rd had exploded. On the 10th, today, we also saw a sunken steamer which had been wrecked by floating ice, so ice. There were 600 passengers aboard that steamer. This is ice at the southern end of Illinois. So you're getting ice interfering with shipping very far down the Mississippi River. The next day, the day had hardly begun when a steamer overtook us, apparently bent on passing us. It approached too close to the shore, ran against tree trunks, and sank before our very eyes. I don't know if that counts as a collision, but it's certainly racing on the rivers. Same day, shortly after noon, we stopped at a small island called Quarantine Island. Cholera had broken out on our ship, so everybody stopped there to be checked for cholera. 28 were suffering from this disease, of which number 7 were detained. This I love. During the medical examination, the remainder crept out of their beds and hid themselves. At 4 o'clock, we saw St. Louis. So the people of St. Louis have to be just overjoyed that 21 people with cholera are coming into town on this steamboat. And my guess is that was not unique to the steamboat. This shows, so that was on the Mississippi. This is just a slide that shows the location of wrecks on the Missouri River of steamboats. And so it didn't get any better when you went farther west. In addition, you had to come on a sailing ship to get to New Orleans in the first place. So before 1855, there were 79 ships that sailed from Liverpool to New Orleans, 9 from Liverpool to New York, and 1 steamship went from Liverpool to Boston. The average time to New York was 35 days, to New Orleans 55 days, and by steamship 13 days. So basically you've got another almost 2 months on a steamship before you get there. So now you're up to 6 months of supplies you need. Now I had the same relative that hired on as a teamster, got a job as a sailor on a ship. So he was actually making money all the way across the plains, but most people basically were paying money all the way across the plains. So that context, 6 months, and then Samuel W. Richards leaving as the president of the British Mission to come back to the Salt Lake Valley, leaves on July 8th of 1854 and arrives in Salt Lake on August 26th, 50 days later. So how did he do that? Well, number one, he took a steamship. Across the Atlantic, they were using steamships with wooden side paddle wheels, and they had sail for backup. First steamship was the Savannah, sailed in 1818. The first passenger was the Great Western in 1838. By the 1860s, so later, steamships have iron hulls, compound steam engines, and screw propulsions, and they're much larger, so they become the principal form of passage across the ocean in the 1860s. As far as I know, this is the Richard's journey on the steamship Niagara was only the second by a group of saints, and he was the only one, I think, on this voyage. The one from Liverpool to Boston in 1852 had about 12 coming. This was on the steamship Niagara. It was a mail packet. He said on July 8th he went on board, sailed for Boston at 9:45 a.m. And I'm just going to skip some of these things. He talks about they're doing 14 RPM. I'm thinking, that is really slow, but I assume that's the paddle wheels going around 14 times in a minute, and maybe that's pretty fast. He does note that even when they're sailing head on to the wind, they're running at 235 miles a day. So most sailing ships, you would be tacking back and forth and make hardly any progress if you're head on to the wind. On the 18th, so 10 days later, they arrive at Halifax, and he goes ashore for a while. On the 20th, they land in Boston at 8 a.m. They average 240 miles a day. So 13 days on the steamship, 3,119 miles, and then he has an 8-hour layover. Now next, you have to go from Boston to the Missouri River. Now why didn't the people start using steamships earlier? Well, in 1852, when they arrived in Boston on the Niagara, after crossing the ocean in 13 days, it wasn't for another 103 days that they show up on the Missouri River ready to go west. So it took a long time to get from Boston to the Missouri River prior to the time they had a railroad. So we're just going to build a railroad across the continent, and this is a really haphazard thing. They build it between a couple of towns at a time, and there's not a lot of organization. So we've got railroads in eastern New York and railroads in western New York. And they're building along the Erie Canal. They're taking passengers off the Erie Canal because it's slow. And so they can provide passenger traffic a lot faster on the railroad. But it's working its way across the ocean. By 1840, you can't get very far on a railroad still. 1841, making a little progress. Look at how many railroads there are in New York. There's a railroad between every 2 principal cities in New York. And after a few years, those will be joined in a single railroad. But the railroad, year by year, keeps working its way across the country. Finally, in 1853, the New York Central merges all of those railroads. The Grand Trunk Railroad starts west in Canada, and we start the Alton and Sangamon Railroad from in southern Illinois starts working its way up. And then finally, in 1854, we have a railroad that reaches all the way from Boston to Alton, Illinois. And there's also a branch that goes to New York, but Stanley W. Richards is going to go to Boston. And so he writes about that railroad journey. The second leg of his journey from Boston to Alton on 9 different railroads. But he buys a single ticket that takes him all the way through St. Louis and pays $28.50 for it. Took cars for 2:15 p.m. for St. Louis via Niagara Falls. About 11 a.m. on the 21st, arrived at the suspension bridge. In 1854, the suspension bridge across the Niagara River is done for pedestrians. A year later, it will also take train traffic across that bridge. So he walks across the bridge. When he gets to Detroit, he has to take a ferry across the Detroit River at Windsor, and then he gets on the train for Chicago. On the 22nd, so 2 days after he left Boston, he arrives in Chicago at 8 in the morning, a little too late for the train to St. Louis. The next day is Sunday. There's no trains on Sunday. He's going to get the midnight train Monday morning for St. Louis, but somebody takes his luggage to the wrong station, so he misses the midnight train, and he takes the train at 8 o'clock the next morning. And he arrives in Alton, Illinois at 4 a.m. On the 25th of July. So leaves Boston July 20th and arrives on July 25th at Alton, Illinois. Almost 1,300 miles in 4.5 days with a 2-day layover. So it's a really 2.5-day trip if you make your connections. We also walked across the suspension bridge, had a nice view of the Niagara Falls, and took the ferry across the Detroit River. The third leg of his journey is by steamship. So this is the riskiest leg of the journey. But it happens that he has very good fortune. He takes a steamship from Alton, Illinois down to St. Louis, which is only 25 miles, gets there in 3 hours. And then he gets on the Polar Star, which has the record in 1852 for the fastest steamship run from St. Louis to Leavenworth, Kansas, which is where he's going. And so he gets on it. It's not a record run. He leaves on the 25th at 5 p.m., arrives at Leavenworth on the 28th about dusk, so about 3 days. That's about 450 miles. He's averaging 6 miles an hour. And he goes up to Weston, Missouri, so he spent 3.5 days on a steamboat. The last leg of his journey is to cross the prairie. He's 3 days preparing to leave. He's going in mule carts, and he's going with a couple of people, and they're gathering the stuff they need to make the journey. On August 1st, they leave about noon. They go to Fort Leavenworth, and they just visit for about 4 hours and leave at 4 p.m. And then over the next several days, he overtakes other companies that are traveling west. On the 5th, he overtook the Williams Freight Company. On the 7th, they got to Kearney. That means they had traveled 57 hours from Leavenworth. They'd gone 370 miles. They're averaging 6.5 miles an hour, or 65 miles a day. On the 9th, they passed the Eldridge Company, and that Eldridge included Agnes, James, and my great-grandfather, William John Armstrong, who was 4 years old. Passed him at 10:30 that night. The next day, they passed another company at Cam's Company near Ash Hollow. On the 12th, he overtook the Danish Company near Chimney Rock. This is the Danish company that had the cow wander away at Fort Laramie, and the Sioux killed the cow, and the Army killed the Sioux, and the Great Sioux War started as a result of this. Well, he passed them on the way. He finished traveling that day at 2:30 a.m. So full moon on the 10th of July, so he was making best use of all possible daylight. I'm sure that was a technique that was developed during the gold rush, that you traveled whenever you could see anything. On the 15th, he overtook the Richardson and the Job Smith companies, and he reached Fort Laramie on the 14th. Went on 2 miles and caught up with the Fields Company and camped with them overnight. And then the really important thing I think happens. The next day, he went 6 miles to Ward and George's, and we'll talk about that in a second again, and he changed animals. So he bought new mules in Wyoming on the 15th of August after 2 weeks. On the 20th, he stopped on the Muddy, breakfast on the Muddy, dinner at the 3 Crossings, and for the night, he stopped just before the last crossing of the Sweetwater, On the 24th, he got to Bridger, and on the 26th, he came into town, Salt Lake City, about 1 p.m. He says, taking all by surprise. Well, of course they were surprised. They didn't know he was coming, but they would have been even more surprised to know that he'd left less than 2 months before. And so his 26 days to cross the prairie averaged 44 miles per day. His entire trip, 50 days. So the question then is, can you make that journey shorter for other immigrants too? So the first leg is crossing the ocean. Well, the first thing they do is they change the port of destination from New Orleans to New York. We already know that's 55 days down to 30 some, so they shorten it. There's still only 4 steam boats in those next 13 years, and my guess is steamboats are much more expensive because they're new and they're fast. But you can save an average 16 days from Liverpool going to New York instead of going to Chicago. And then in 1869, obviously they changed to steamships, and it changes, saving 26 more days. You can also make the journey shorter by taking the railroad instead of taking ferries. So in 1865 or 1855, they start the railroad from New York to St. Louis, and then riverboat to Atchison, Kansas, and then wagon. That saves 4 days, basically. 1856, they moved the destination to Iowa City, Iowa, and that saves only 2 days, but they're off the ferries, and so that's a good thing. In 1859, they're taking rail to St. Joseph and riverboat to Florence, and then a wagon. That's 12 and a half days faster. And then finally, 1864, the ferry only goes to Wyoming, and then they're taking a wagon, and that saves us 16 days relative to the 21 days on a riverboat before. So what about the third leg, crossing the prairie? Well, we already know that mules travel faster, half again faster than oxen, and horses the same thing, but it's more expensive. You need feed. You have to pull all the people too, because you can't walk and keep up with mules. You could make it shorter by changing the jumping off place, and then maybe there's some other possibilities too. So let's look at changing the jumping off place. On the left is 1847 to 1854 jumping off places. Obviously they left from a lot of different places. Most of them were Canesville. On the right are the 1855 to 1867, still a lot of different places, most of them Florence. The average mileage in the first 8 years was 1,089 miles. The average mileage in the second 13 years was 1,120. So they're not traveling shorter distances. If you're going to shorten the journey, you have to do it differently. And mostly they didn't use oxen or horses. Mostly they didn't use mules or horses. They still used oxen. It turns out that somehow they figured out how to travel faster. So if you look at mileage for all of those 1847 to 1854 journeys, the average mileage per day for those various companies was 11.4 miles per day. 1855 to 1867, again, different mileages from all those places, but the average mileage per day is 14.9 miles. It's a significant difference in mileage. The average from 11 and a half to almost 15 miles per day.
We're running out of time. I'm sorry.
We're good. So you can shorten it by reducing the time on a ship, reducing the time on a riverboat, and reducing the time on the prairie. That's a total savings of 6 weeks, which reduces your 6 months of provisions down to 4.5. Possible factors to contributing to faster times on the plains is still the same wagons, still the same oxen, maybe a better trail. There's also forts or settlements on the way, and there's kind of a list there of when they're developed. There's mail and stage stations, there's some trading posts, and there's some improvements on the trail. Notably, the Seminole Cutoff in 1853 that avoids 4 crossings of the Sweetwater River, and the Rocky Ridge, which I'm sure the handcar companies would have loved to know about. Also, the railroad extends farther west. In 1867, you could take the railroad all the way to Omaha, to North Platte, Nebraska, and that takes 36 days off the route. And we'll just skip the rest of that. That's statistical analysis. So basically, the trail got better. It got faster. you didn't have to invest quite so much to get across the plains. And of course, by the next year, you can go by the railroad all the way, and you can do it in just over a week. Or if you take the ship crossing it's like 2.5 weeks. So.
Thank you.